If you've ever wanted 360 watts of power to drive your speakers, then you might be interested in what I'm going to share with you today. What I've got here are the Burson Timekeeper GT amplifiers. These are monoblock amplifiers designed purely for driving speakers. I know some crazy people out there use them for headphones. I don't personally recommend that, but hey, if you want to, that's up to you. But the Timekeeper GT is built on similar kind of technology to what's been used in the Burson Soloist 3X GT and the Burson Soloist 3 GT that I've talked about here on the channel before. But it's all been updated now. This is a 2023 version of the products. And so this marks the first of two videos I'll be doing very soon, starting off here today with the Timekeeper GT, and then also revisiting the Soloist 3X GT and 3 GT to tell you what those upgrades are all about. And so before we get into the details, let's take a look at the Burson Timekeeper 3X GT. Now it's worth mentioning before I go too far that I've got the Timekeepers sitting here on Burson's own Mothership. You can buy the Mothership in a couple of different variants. They've got the 2-shelf version, and then they've got, I just had to check behind me, the 4-shelf version as well. So that could be really helpful if you've got a separate preamp somewhere, or maybe one that can fit down the bottom. You might be able to run the 2-shelf version. But if you're anything like me, the 4-shelf version is great because you can then add your DAC, your preamp in the form of something like a Soloist GT, and then a couple of Timekeepers as well. It keeps it all vertical, it gives them enough space for ventilation. It's a really lovely system. I'm not here to review the Mothership, even though I think they look fantastic, but I did want you to know what it is that you're looking at here. And I'll be doing a separate shorts video of some sort, or maybe a very micro review of the Mothership. So if you do want to know more, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell, because that one will be dropping in the coming weeks. For now though, let's turn our attention back to the Timekeeper 3X GT. And the first thing I should mention is that these come in at $4,000 US for a pair. What that's getting you, as I already mentioned, is a pair of monoblock amplifiers. And if you're not familiar with monoblocks, if you've heard the term but didn't really understand what they mean, essentially think about it as separating your two channels of your stereo speaker setup. So rather than having one amplifier with left and right channels coming out, all you're doing is you're putting the left and the right channels in their own separate cases. As you'll see when we do the tour, each of these amplifiers only has an output for a single speaker, and so that's why you need a pair of these to drive a stereo setup. The key benefits in going down the monoblock path is more power first and foremost, because instead of having a single amplifier, you're getting two, which is not to say that you can't get an integrated kind of all-in-one left-right channel amplifier that does have the same sorts of power as these. But in many cases, by having a dedicated power supply, dedicated amplification circuit for an individual channel, you can often get more power, but more importantly, and this is I think where monoblocks really come into play, by completely separating the left and the right channels into their own separate cases, their own power supplies, their own circuits, you're getting complete isolation of those two channels. You won't get any crosstalk at all between your left and the right, other than what might have come from the DAC, of course. And so theoretically, this can give you the best possible separation of your left and right channels. Of course, the quality of the sound from each of the monoblocks, and therefore the quality of the circuit inside, is also very important, and we will get to that soon. But that's the theory behind why some people like monoblocks. I'll provide a tour in the moment so you know exactly what's going on here, but before we do the tour, I just want to cover off some basic specs. And the first thing is to let you know that these run in a combination of Class A and Class AB modes. I'm not going to try and explain that one here now, but essentially Class A is a bit less efficient, theoretically can sound better, but then as we move up into higher power requirements, it will switch over to Class AB, which can still sound fantastic, of course. And the way that power is managed is that the first 30 watts coming out of the Timekeeper GT, or the Timekeeper 3X GT technically, the first 30 watts is going to be in Class A, full Class A mode, and then once you go beyond that, the rest of the power is coming in Class AB mode. Now, if you happen to look at the website, there is, I think at the time of this review, a bit of a typo there. These are rated to have a total of 180 watts per channel or per monoblock. And the website currently says that the first 30 watts is delivered in Class A and the next 180 watts is delivered in Class AB. I'm assuming they mean the first 30 watts and then the next 150 watts. So as I understand it, the total of these is 180 watts and the first 30 is in Class A. That's probably what you really need to take away from this. Something else that's good to know about the Timekeeper GT is that they're designed in such a way that they're going to work effectively with DACs that are designed with an attenuating preamp stage. And what I mean by that is that many actual dedicated preamps are designed to add some gain to the signal. So they'll take maybe a 2-volt input from a standard DAC, and then they'll actually add, as part of their volume control, they may add some gain to it, meaning that they're adding extra voltage. What that means is that monoblocks like the Timekeepers here are often designed to be working with inputs of 2 volts plus. Whereas if you've got a DAC that's using an attenuating volume control where it's actually cutting the output level of the DAC, you might be feeding at times maybe only 1 volt into something like the Timekeepers here. And so one of the things that's been done by Burson to help maximize sound quality from these is they've got a dedicated input buffer stage. Now don't worry if you don't know what those words mean. The key thing is that it's designed to take lower voltage inputs and provide a bit of extra gain itself before it goes on to the amplification stage. And so to simplify that further, what that means is that you've got 2 different gain settings on these monoblocks. If you're using some sort of a preamp system that delivers sufficient voltage for the Timekeepers, you can just leave it in low gain, but you can also switch it to high gain mode if you need that extra bit of boost. So that's a really nice feature. It means they're very versatile with any kind of input source. But while we're talking about preamps, I should really specify there is no volume control on these. If you're new to power amps and monoblocks, it's very important to know you can't hook these up to something like, say, a shit Yggdrasil or a shit Bifrost 2, because you're going to have no volume control unless you're using what's in your system software, and they're generally not a good way to go. So you will need some kind of preamplification going on in your source chain, and that's where things like the Burson Soloist 3X GT come into play, or if you've got a DAC with a volume control built in, that's going to work just fine as well. So do keep that in mind, you must have some kind of external volume control before you feed the signal into the Timekeeper GT. And so with all that covered off, let's do a quick tour of the Timekeepers, and then I'm going to talk about sound, of course. Starting off with the tour, this is a very, very quick and easy tour. On the front panel, we just have a power switch, nothing else. When I say nothing else you need to actually interact with. There's also, and you can't really see it here, but it's in the B-roll, there's a little set of very fine perforations in the front aluminium panel, and that's going to allow the LED light to shine through. It's going to show you in standby mode, it's a very narrow little light, and then when you switch on the Timekeeper, that little narrow band opens up and fills the whole little stretch of perforations that are about sort of this wide on the screen, or on the front panel, and then the colour of those lights is also going to tell you a little bit about what mode it's in. It's not one of those things where you have to necessarily remember what each colour means. It just helps you know if you're switching between the inputs and or the gain stage. And so with that in mind, let's flip around to the back because that's really where everything's going on in the Timekeeper GTs. Looking now at the back of these, and what we've got going on the back is again pretty simple, but there's a little bit to go through. Starting off on the far side here, we've got our power connection. This is a custom connector. It's a screw in, I'm guessing it's some sort of DIN connector of some sort, but it's going to be coming directly from Burson's own power supply designed for the Timekeeper GT, and that's using the same supercharger technology that we've talked about before on the channel. Specifically, that's a very high frequency switch mode power supply design, and in my testing of the supercharger supplies with things like the Soloist 3XP, which is the lower level headphone amplifier, going from the regular switch mode power supply to something like a supercharger power supply made a really big difference in sound. So it's nice to see a premium product like this one coming with the top level power supply from Burson. Right next to the power supply input, we've also got a couple of 3.5mm sockets. Those are for 12 volt triggers. And so that's where pairing these up with something like a Burson Soloist 3X GT or some other device that's designed with 12 volt triggers, that's where this is really helpful. Because what this actually means is that you can have it set up so that when you switch on your source device, whether it's your preamp or your DAC if it's got 12 volt triggers, when you switch on that device, it can send a 12 volt switch signal out to the Timekeepers and switch them both automatically. And so you don't need a separate volume control for the Timekeepers, and you also don't have to manually go over and press the button on both. There is one little wrinkle here, and hopefully Burson will hear this and maybe make some changes, and that is that the one problem I have is that if you are using this with a Soloist 3X GT or a Soloist 3 GT, it doesn't seem to recognise if you're in headphone mode or preamp mode. So if you do switch on your Soloist 3X GT to listen to headphones and you've got it connected up to the Timekeepers with the 12-volt trigger, it's actually going to turn the Timekeepers on. It does mean for me then that I've got to reach over and switch off the Timekeepers if I'm here for headphone listening only. So it would be very nice if Burson can set it up in some sort of way that it only sends out the 12-volt trigger if it's switched on in preamp mode and or when you move over to preamp mode from one of the other settings. I'm not sure if that's possible, there might be limitations that prevent that, but that's just a small issue that I had running the Timekeepers with the Soloist GT as preamp. Moving on now with the Tour though, and as we move past the 12-volt triggers, the next thing is the very obvious thing that you'd expect to see on a monoblock, and that's a pair of binding posts with both banana plug and spade connection capabilities. And I should add that you can also, of course, do a wire through a hole in the middle of that and then just screw it tight. But I think most people operating at this sort of level of amplification are probably going to be using banana plugs or spade type connectors. So that's there. They're a nice high quality binding post, very good to interact with, very secure, very stable. Coming then across closer to me, we've then got our inputs. And remembering that these are monoblocks, so these are a mono amplifier. You need two of them, as I already said. And that's why we've only got a single pair of binding posts, just one per channel. So we've got a pair here that could be left or right, depending on what you plug in. And then the other pair will be on the other amplifier. And the same is true for the inputs. So we've got a single XLR and a single RCA, meaning that let's say this was your right speaker amp. What you're going to do is take your right XLR output or RCA output from your DAC and plug it in here. And then the left RCA output or left XLR output, that's going to go into the other amplifier. From there, we've just got two more buttons over here, and that's your input switch and your gain switch. Now, one thing that's worth noting here is that even though you can run two different inputs into the Timekeepers, it's not easy and quick to switch. If you want to switch between the inputs, you are going to be doing it by having to reach behind each amplifier and find out, and you can often not see this back panel, find out which one's which. The top switch is for the gain modes I spoke about before, there's just the two of them, and it toggles just back and forth. And then the bottom one is for your inputs, and it just toggles back and forth. So even though these will accept two inputs, don't think of this as a system where you're going to be switching regularly back and forth. There's no remote control, you're going to have to do it manually, and you have to do it on each amp separately. Having said that, before you get too upset, what that does mean is that if you do have a preamp like a Soloist GT, that's where you're going to do all your switching. And that's really how these are designed. These are designed to have another device before them in the source chain that takes care of all of your inputs, your input switching, your volume control, etc. These are really designed just to provide the power to drive your speakers and not really do anything else. So I think it's worth putting that into context. That's why the controls are on the back. They're not meant to be a sort of smart multi-interface device. And so with all that said, let's now jump to the stuff that really matters, and that's about how these guys sound. The most obvious thing when I first fired up the Timekeepers was just how clean and resolving they are. I did most of my testing with these running the Harbath P3 ESR XD speakers. I've also used them with the Revel M105 speakers that I've got coming up for review. And in both cases, they just produce a marvellously clean, clear, but not in any way analytical or cold or harsh sound. They produce a wonderful sense of resolution and detail in the sound, but absolutely the standout for me when comparing these to other devices, and I'll talk about some comparisons shortly, the key thing for me when I start to compare them is just how well they image. The quality of the image and the general soundstage presentation from the Timekeepers is nothing short of spectacular for me. Again, I'm running a near-field setup. I don't see any reason why this wouldn't translate to a full-size, larger room setup. But for me, with the Harbath or the Revel M105s in a near-field system with the speakers about probably 1 and a bit meters away from my face, in this sort of setup, the soundstage and the imaging is just magical. Some of the best that I've actually heard. As I've already alluded to, I think tonality from these is spot on. I don't feel like they're really skewing anything in any direction. They've got a good sense of control over the bass. The mid-range is nicely kind of full-bodied but also textured. And as we move up into the treble, it's very crisp, very resolved. There's really nothing to poke holes in. And then, as is often the case, it's much easier to start to define how an amplifier sounds when you put it next to another one, so you've got a bit of a reference point of which one's doing what better and worse. So we'll get to that in just a second, but the final thing I want to talk about before I get to the comparisons is that I did also check to make sure if there's any difference between the XLR input and the RCA input, and the good news is there's not. Running both inputs from the Chord Hugo TT2 and switching between them, I heard absolutely zero difference between them in terms of the sonic performance. And so at this point we've established that in isolation, the Timekeeper GT is a fantastic sounding amplifier. It's absolutely top tier, top class, highly resolving, wonderful imaging, and very well tonally balanced. So then the question we turn to is, does it stack up with other amplifiers that you might be thinking about at around about the same price point? I don't have a large collection of speaker amps at this stage in my collection, although I should mention I've got 3 new kind of lower price speaker amps coming up for review soon. These are all Class D options from SMSL and Topping, so make sure you subscribe if you're interested in some lower priced options, some more affordable options. But while we're playing at this higher level, the other amplifier that I do have here that I thought was worth comparing with the Timekeepers was the Enleum AMP-23R. I reviewed this a little while ago and absolutely loved it for its ability to combine a compact form factor with a headphone amp and the ability to drive difficult speakers. And so it made for me a really good reference point with the Timekeepers. Because if you're running a near-field setup like me, or if you value space and having only one amplifier box instead of 2, then you could look at something like the Enleum AMP-23R. Now it retails for about $6,250 and so what you're getting there is an amplifier and headphone amplifier with volume control, and so it's kind of like smushing the Timekeepers and a Soloist GT all into one box. So price-wise it really stacks up. If you're going to run these two with a Soloist, you're spending over $6,000 and all of a sudden you could buy yourself the Enleum. So the question for me was, which is the better option? Are you compromising to smush it all into one box? Or is it actually a better choice to save the space and go with the single option of the Enleum AMP-23R rather than 3 boxes and maybe a mothership or something to store them on? It's worth noting at this point that the Enleum, I think from memory, produces 25 watts, so it's nowhere near as powerful as the 180 watts per channel that you're going to get from these guys. But having said that, it's still plenty powerful enough for most speakers. Unless you've got a large room and not particularly efficient speakers, the Enleum's going to drive most speakers pretty well. And if you're in a near-field setup like mine, and that's where the space factor comes in, that's where the Enleum really shines. And so I set this one up with the Chord Hugo TT2 as my DAC and my preamp for this one. I took the Soloist GT out of the chain for this one because I really wanted to isolate just the sound of the Timekeeper GT and compare it to the Enleum, just in case you're in a situation where you've maybe got a different preamp, an external preamp. I didn't want to kind of not muddy the waters because the GT is a very clean and resolving preamp, that being the Soloist GT. But I wanted to take it out so there was one less variable to consider. So hooking up the TT2 as the DAC and the preamp into the Timekeepers, and then also feeding out to the Enleum, one of the tracks I listened to was Gobbledygook by Sigur Rós. And I'm probably saying that wrong, so if anyone's got pronunciation advice for Sigur Rós, please pop it down in the comments below. But listening to that and jumping between the Enleum AMP-23R and the Timekeeper GTs, what I heard, as you'd expect to start off with, was the excellent separation and imaging that the Timekeepers deliver. The vocals are beautifully focused and right in the middle of the stage. And the dynamics are fantastic as well. There's a wonderful sense of snap on all the drums. There's a great sense of attack when it needs it, but then also some delicacy around the quieter moments in the sound. It's just a really magical experience listening to the Timekeepers. And by the way, this was all with the P3 ESR XDs from Harbath. But the same is true with the Revel M105s, and indeed I'd expect with any speaker you connect these up with, as long as there's enough power, and with 180 watts on tap, there absolutely should be. Moving over then to the Enleum AMP-23R, and things got a bit smoother. You could say it was more refined, or maybe it was just slightly rolled off. It was just what I would call a smoother sound. I didn't feel like it got thick, or muddied, or muffled in any way, but there was a clear difference in the way the sound was being delivered. I find the Burson gear using the V6 Vivid op amps of theirs always tends to have a really crisp, detailed top end. Not harsh, not strident at all, but very crisp and very detailed. And that's probably the key difference here. The Enleum is a slightly more relaxed, slightly more laid back sounding top end, whereas the Timekeeper sound is a bit more energetic and a bit crispier. And that's going to suit different people and different speakers differently, so do keep that in mind as well. As I continued to listen more with the Enleum, I feel like the vocal wasn't as tightly defined in space. And this goes back to what I said before, the real party piece for me with the monoblock Timekeepers is their ability to just focus that image perfectly. It's pristine, it's spot on where it should be. You can absolutely close your eyes and just imagine the whole soundscape kind of opening out in front of you. The Timekeepers do that really, really well. The Enleum is no slouch in that regard at all. It's an excellent sounding amp, it does imaging and space very, very well as well, but that's where the Timekeepers for me just step ahead over the Enleum. Likewise, the dynamics I spoke about before are slightly reduced from the Enleum. It's still a dynamic and clean and snappy sounding amp on the Harbaths, but it didn't have quite the same sense of energy and rhythm that I felt I was getting from the Timekeepers. And again, that comes back to that crisp but refined top end. And so for me, as I went back and forth between the two, keeping in mind how much I love the Enleum, by the end of the testing, it was the Timekeepers that I wanted to keep hooked up. I do think that the Enleum can be a bit more laid back, a bit more relaxed, and that's definitely going to suit some people, some rooms, and also some speaker setups. But for me, the ability of the Timekeepers to just tighten that image and that focus to produce a soundstage that I think might just be a little bit wider than the Enleum and still just as deep and very, very clean and well separated in the sounds, I think that for me is the bit that takes the Timekeepers over the edge. In terms of things like resolution, top-end detail, dynamics, I think both are excellent. I would happily listen to either, and it's going to depend very much on tastes. For my setup in my system, the Timekeeper works wonderfully, and that's part of why I've chosen to keep those driving my speakers. But then I think if we look at the Enleum, there will definitely be people out there that prefer its sort of slightly more refined or laid back sound. It's a bit more relaxing to listen to. If you've got a set of speakers that are a bit more aggressive in the treble, the Timekeepers could go too far. Not so much because they're kind of aggressive themselves, so much as the fact that they're not going to help to ease that off at all. Whereas I can see the Enleum helping to pull back a bit on the treble from a more aggressive or strident speaker. And so I think both of these are fantastic options. This comparison hasn't reduced my respect and my love of the Enleum. It's just shown me that there are other options that are equally as capable and in some cases more capable depending on your preferences. What I would say from all of this is that I think if you're in a position where you don't need to reduce the space and the footprint of your amplifier, if you can actually house a couple of these monoblocks, if you've got something to provide your volume control external to the monoblocks, then I think the Timekeepers could be an even better option than the Enleum. But it also shows me that if you do want a compact all-in-one that is a very capable and incredibly enjoyable headphone amp and also speaker amp, then that's where the Enleum does come into play. And so I could wrap things up there, but there's another little wrinkle that we can add here. And that is that part of the upgrade with the 2023 range of the Soloist GTs and the Timekeepers is that they're now upgradable not just in terms of having the op-amp swappable, but also the power supply control modules too. In my recent review of the SPL Phonitor XE, I talked about the fact that the Soloist GTs can now be upgraded with these little guys here. And what these are the silent power modules. So the biggest change moving from the older versions of the GTs up to the new 2023 versions is that now you can also swap these guys around. The Timekeeper GTs and the Soloist GTs come with the SP1 modules installed. Now they all look the same, so whether it's SP1 or SP2, they look just like this. There's some stamping or lettering on the back that tells you whether it's an SP1 or an SP2 module. But what these are is the Silent Power 1 and Silent Power 2 modules. And so within each Timekeeper there are two of these. There's one for the positive and one for the negative power rail. And inside these, going from the SP1 to the SP2, what you're essentially doing is you're upgrading the power control chip. So this is the chip that kind of regulates how the power is managed, keeps things very linear, I would assume. I don't know the technicalities of it, but it's just upgrading, and I say just, but the impact is significant. It's just upgrading the way the power is controlled within the power supply stage of the amplifier. Now, at the time of recording this, I believe these are going to be retailing at about $300 US, so it's a significant upgrade. I think that's $300 for the whole set, so you'd spend $300 US and you would get enough to take care of both of your monoblocks or a single Soloist GT. But by adding these in, you can upgrade the Timekeepers further. So everything I've told you to date with the comparison with the Enleum, my original listening thoughts, that was all in stock form with no extra money spent, no upgrading done. But if you do want to go and spend the extra $300 US once these are released, you're going to get another upgrade again over what I've described, and it's not a small upgrade. When switching from the Silent Power 1 to Silent Power 2 modules, what you're going to hear is a cleaner background to start with, or more to the point, you're not going to hear it. And what that means is that by cleaning up the background of the sound, you get more space between all the sounds, you get more refinement in things like the treble, you get more clarity and resolution because of what's not there rather than what's there. Now this may sound like you can hear background noise or something with the SP1 modules. You absolutely can't. As I've already described, in their stock form, these are a wonderful, top-class quality monoblock. But once you add the SP2 modules, they just get better. And it's almost kind of magical in the sense that, as I said before, it's about what's being removed, but you didn't even know it was there to start with. And even when you go back to the SP1 modules, you can't hear that there's any noise there. You can't hear that there's anything kind of imperfect about the signal. But somehow, the inclusion of the SP2 modules and the benefits they bring to the power stage, that just cleans up the amplifier even further. And what you get as a result is a sharper image, a better soundstage, more separation between sounds, and a more refined overall delivery. So resolution improves as well, sense of transparency, detail, textual information, it all gets better. The overall tonality of the amplifier does not change a bit, and you'd hope that it didn't, of course. This is not an op-amp, this is a power supply improvement. It's going to clean up the power supply. It's going to make sure that the internal circuitry is running at its optimum levels by getting just the perfect power when it needs it. And so the end result is essentially an upgrade of everything I told you about before. And what that does mean is that I feel like with the SP2 modules installed, I do think that the Timekeepers take a clear step ahead of something like the Enleum. And so that's quite exciting to me. The fact that we can take an amplifier like this that is already so good, and the same is true for the Soloist GT, whether it's the 3X or the 3GT, the same is true for those as well. We can take these products that are already fantastic, that are already well and truly performing at or above their price point, and then for $300 more, we can take them even further. So it's a pretty exciting opportunity that you can easily upgrade a device like this and potentially take that next step without having to swap around your whole system. Theoretically, I don't know if Burson have any plans, but maybe there'll be an SP3 in the future, an SP4, who knows? It's possible even that these could continue to grow and evolve and develop even further than the SP2 module. Again, I don't know anything about that. Burson haven't told me about any plans beyond the SP2, but I'm just theorizing that this upgradability potentially offers some wonderful long-term sort of longevity and upgradability for the Timekeeper range. And so to pull all that back into context, what I'm saying here is that for $4,000, you can get a set of monoblocks to drive a pair of stereo speakers, and these monoblocks are going to be absolutely fantastic. They're going to be just as good, I think, as anything else on the market that you're likely to find for around about the same price. And in some cases, they'll be better. From there, you can also spend an extra $300 in the future and upgrade them further. And that's going to take them to the next level. I don't know what price point I'd say they sit at then, but they're definitely a significant step up. But it is worth keeping in mind that if you're pairing them up with something like a Soloist GT as your preamp and headphone amp, you might need to also factor in a set of these for the Soloist. And I will talk about these in the context of the Soloist when I do my Soloist review coming up soon. That's going to be comparing the 2023 single-ended 3GT and the balanced version 3X GT. So I'll cover that off further then, but keep in mind that if you've decided to buy a pair of Timekeepers and a Soloist, you've started off with an initial investment of just over $6,000, so similar to the Enleum that we talked about before, and then you would need to spend a further $600 to get a set of SP2s for the Timekeepers and a set of SP2s for the Soloist GT. So do factor that into your equations, but the good news is the end result you're going to get by that point is nothing short of a spectacular tower of sound. So I'm going to wrap things up here by saying that I'm insanely impressed with the Timekeeper GT. I wasn't really expecting to be impressed by them. I was so impressed by the Enleum AMP-23R already. I've tried other different speaker amps, and the Enleum just had it over and above those, as it should at the price. It's been the most expensive speaker amp I've tried with my near-field setup so far. But the Timekeepers have absolutely set a new benchmark once you add the SP2. As I said, at the SP1 level, I think the Enleum and the Timekeepers go neck and neck, but with the SP2 modules, the Timekeepers clearly step ahead. And if you don't happen to need an external box for your volume control, maybe you've already got a DAC that does it, then you can also get these for less than the Enleum too. They're also more powerful, so these are going to drive any speaker you can probably think of. And so that's where I do think these are a really fantastic option. Of course, they take up more space, there's an extra power point required, so you do need to factor all that in, and of course having a volume control available. But if you can do that, if you've got the space for it, if you've got the devices for it in terms of your preamp taken care of, then I think the Timekeeper GT is an easy recommendation. I can't see anybody being disappointed with the sound out of these in their stock form, and then they're going to be even more impressed if you add the SP2s. So the Timekeeper GTs get a resounding recommendation from me. I recommend that you go out and buy a pair if you're in the market for a great pair of monoblocks, a great pair of speaker amps, or a speaker amp in general. These are definitely one you should look at if you're working with that sort of budget. Just to be completely transparent, I have no affiliation with Burson whatsoever. I make no money if you buy these products. I just think they're fantastic. I am absolutely impressed with these, and I look forward to every single listening session with the Harvests, the Timekeepers, and the Soloist GT as my preamp. So if you're interested in picking up a set of these, I'll put links down below in the description as I always do. Click through the links, grab yourself a pair, and enjoy every moment of listening. And so at this point, as always, I hope you found the video useful, helpful, and informative. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, and please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. I've got a bunch more speaker content coming soon. As I said, I've got the Revel M105 speakers coming soon. I've also got that review of the SMSL and topping kind of affordable digital power amp designs. So those are coming as well. That's going to be one big video looking at all three of those. And then I've got some more speakers coming down the track. So heaps and heaps of speaker content, but still heaps of other content too for headphone listeners and speaker listeners, whether it's headphones, DACs, preamps, etc. So make sure you hit the subscribe button, ring the notification bell. But for now, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.